1 week season.
Hey, and welcome in OWS fam. So glad you are with us. We are back in the DFS lab. As always, it's presented by 1 week season, where the purpose of this show is build a DraftKings lineup and really use that as a vehicle to talk through the upcoming slate. Obviously, it's just Tuesday, October 8th. So this is a very early look at week 6, but really excited to dig in. I'm your host, Cheeseman, as always. And today, welcoming up Hilow. Hilow, how's it going? How was your week 5?
Another Millie Sweat, man. We had another Millie Sweat. This was in the $20 because last week I try and attack the 555 millis and the 100 millis, which I don't know if they'll have another one this year, but they had one week 1. But the millis that have smaller field sizes, I'm typically trying to attack this year. This past week I went heavy like money wise because I really liked the slate, and there was one massive leverage spot that kind of made me just love this slate. We'll talk about that shortly and what kind of leverage is. But I threw like 10 rosters into the $20 milli, with most of my bankroll for the week going to like the double spy, the stuff that the single entry stuff that I'm typically doing. And it was my millies that had the sweat, which was fun.
It's fantastic.
Actually, there were 2 big bets that I made this past week. One was a really good leverage spot from a 2-player stack, a mini correlation. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other was game environment bet that the field was not on. So I think let's anchor on those 2 things like real quick. Before we get into like the roster construction.
No, I love that. Yeah. I mean, go ahead. I mean, yeah, game environment bets. And then also just would love just to hear kind of your thoughts on what leverage is, why it's important for someone who, maybe you're watching this and you hear, especially 1 week season, us talk about leverage quite a bit. But you might be wondering how do you actually do that in a way that helps you?
Yeah. So we'll start with the game environment stuff. So we know scoring is down around the league. We've seen it pick up a little bit over the last 2 weeks, but we know scoring is down. We know passing offenses are down. Passing touchdowns are down. Red zone defense is up. So all of that, like kind of that's the current state of the league. We know it's due to this increase in too high. We know defensive coordinators are kind of, they have made the most recent move in this ongoing like chess battle between offensive and defensive coordinators. And so this idea of game environment bets is a way to get so many pieces of your roster right at once. But we know that like there are different levels of a game environment bet or different levels of success for a game environment. What we're looking for in a game environment bet is for the game to turn into something you had to have or you were not winning without it. And if that happens now with scoring down around the league and with more rushing and the current state of the league that we just covered, if a game environment turns into a 70, 80 point, sometimes back and forth, just crazy shootout, it is that much more likely that another game environment doesn't come close. What was interesting about this last week is there were 2 games where the fourth quarter absolutely blew up. We had the Cincinnati Bengals and the Rams, and then we had the Colts game that absolutely blew up in the fourth quarter. Look, the Colts, I think, were like 17-13 or something crazy, like heading into the fourth quarter.
20 to 10. It was 20 to 10. Colts had 10 points.
Yeah. So then we saw what happened in the fourth quarter. Like there were 5 or 6 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. Same thing with the Bengals. So all of that to say is due to the state of the league right now, scoring down, all the stuff that we covered, a game environment bet becomes that much more important instead of less important. Because if a game does that, if a game takes off, if there's a spark, if 2 years ago when Devin Duvernay returned the opening touchdown or the opening kickoff for a touchdown in the Baltimore and Miami game, we saw what happened in that game. So if there is a spark somewhere, and again, a spark in a game environment, like takes a team from game planning mode or from adjustment phase to the oh shit phase, like immediately. And that's what we're looking for. If that happens, and that's very hard to predict, but if that happens and we capture it, it is that much more likely that another game, it is that much more unlikely due to the state of the league that another game does that. So I really liked the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens game environment this week. We said it around OWS, and you heard multiple people talking about the fact that like that game has the best chance to turn into that oh shit factor that like no other game can come close to this one. It just so happened that like last week the Colts and Jaguars did it as well. But that's kind of the point, is like we love this game environment. Ownership is muted on it because it's so hard to stack it up. And we saw like Joe Burrow doubles make some noise and take down ship majors. It was very interesting that like the Baltimore offense ended up being so spread out, which we don't typically think of it to be, that you didn't need a bring back, but that game environment really, really stuck out to me. So I had Joe Burrow doubles. I had Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase rosters. I had them with Derrick Henry, which kind of meant that I wasn't shipping. But running back was really weird on this last slate, to where there was one running back who put up 20 fantasy points or more, and it was DeAndre Swift. Yeah. And DeAndre Swift was on that roster. The one thing that I really am kicking myself about last week is I never considered double pay down running back. I was blinded by the 5 running backs who were in terrific spots that were pay up options. The Kyron Williams, the Josh Jacobs was one of them. I'll talk to him because he'll lead us into the leverage discussion. There was Derrick Henry, Jordan Mason. So a lot of these guys that were priced up were in very, very good spots. So while I had DeAndre Swift as a pay down, he was my favorite pay down option, I never considered pairing him with Tyrone Tracy. And that probably cost me $1 million, because that would have changed my roster construction to far and away from the field. So that's this idea of game environments. And we'll lead that into when we build the roster. But before we do that, the second big thing here is this idea of leverage. Yeah. A lot of the fantasy community continues to view leverage as, well, this guy's in this pricing range and he's expected high ownership. Let me go to this guy in the same pricing tier. It's like, that doesn't generate any leverage for you, because you're just making a 1v1 bet. That's a pivot. I'm pivoting from this guy to this guy. If this guy directly outscores this guy, then I win. That's not very beneficial. All that's doing is saying I'm making a 1v1 bet, and that's akin to what we're seeing in cash games. Like, cash games are so competitive this year that it's like it's very frequently a 1v1 or a 2v2 for cashing or not. So in this idea of leverage, it's this, I like to think of it, and the way that I think about it is utilizing like computer language if-then statements. So if this player fails, then who benefits the most? Or why did that player fail? Did the team fail? Or was it because somebody else was succeeding? So look at this last week. We had all this interest in the Packers passing game without Christian Watson, without Romeo Doubs. We had all this ownership going to Jordan Mason and to Deebo Samuel. So combined, those two players were combining for like 55% ownership expectation. So when that's the case, and I'm looking at this slate, if the Packers pass game fails, then who was it succeeding? Because we didn't expect the Packers to fail as an offense. So right. I really like the same discussion. We'll carry it over to the 49ers. If a yardage and touchdown back in Jordan Mason was failing, and if Deebo Samuel was failing, we didn't expect the 49ers to be failing. We had an opponent in the Cardinals who were allowing the second most yards per reception. We had the second most explosive plays allowed. We had the second most yards allowed after contact. It was very clear to me that you would get a massive, massive leverage boost by pairing Josh Jacobs with Brandon Ayuk, because now you're making these leveraged bets that if the Packers pass game fails, and if Jordan Mason and Deebo Samuel fail, it wasn't likely that those offenses were failing. So where is that production coming from? Brandon Ayuk hadn't done it yet this season, but he's still Brandon Ayuk. We're in week 5, like all the offseason stuff is behind him. It was very, very clear to me that playing Brandon Ayuk with Josh Jacobs was a massive leverage stance this week. So I took those two things and built rosters kind of around that as my starting point, with Bengals pass game, with Josh Jacobs, with paired him with DeAndre Swift and Brandon Ayuk. And Ayuk had like 93 yards on the first 2 drives. He was cooking. Didn't score the touchdown, which we needed for him to get to the 30+ fantasy point range. But that's variance. So what I was trying to do is take the macro snapshot of the slate and then add in the field tendencies. So in game theory, the observations of the field, or the known field tendencies, are a big part of our decision-making process, because in game theory, all we're trying to do is hone our decision-making process. We take our knowledge of the game, we take the contest rules, and then we take our observations of the field, and this all kind of comes into our decision-making process. And that was a big piece of this last slate. Was I love these spots. My knowledge is pointing me to these spots, to these teams, to the 49ers, to the Packers, to the Bengals and Ravens game environment. Loved Joe Flacco and the Colts passing game. Just so happened that, like, oh my God, another Antonio Pierce game.
Alec Pierce,
Alec Pierce, yeah, not Antonio Pierce,
not
Alec
the Raiders,
Pierce.
But yeah, we're right there. Same here, man. I didn't have any.
I loved Brian Thomas Jr., so he was in there as well. 5,900 cheap wide receiver, almost hit 30 fantasy points as well. So there was a lot of spots that I loved. The field was on some of them. The field was off some of them. And I really, really wanted to amplify those two pieces that we were just talking about in a game environment bet and leverage. So I loved this slate. Second week in a row now with a Millie Sweat. I was at 190 points with Denver defense to go in the afternoon and Brandon Ayuk to go in the afternoon.
Wow.
Yeah. It didn't happen again. Denver defense, they did okay, actually. They're at ownership though. But I think I needed like I probably needed Ayuk to go like ham bonkers crazy. Yeah. I probably needed like 102. So he hit the 100 and score.
What score took the down the millie? Because 190 with like those two, that you probably were like 220-ish, right?
Yeah.
Finished 220 for that line.
It was like 232. Let me double check.
While you do, I got to say, just great. I loved your analogy of the if-then statements on leverage. And with you and Zandamir in the slant on 1 week season, that's in the inner circle membership tier, we're talking about that a lot. And at first I was mentally wrestling with it because I was like, but Deebo, I just feel like Deebo could get 38 or 39. But then it finally clicked for me. Like, the reason Ayuk is a good play is because Deebo's going to be highly owned. And so because they're both kind of like those types of players that can get you big games, but can also get you like 5 or 10, which Deebo got like 3. If Ayuk is lower owned, the if-then statement there and all those rosters with Deebo are going to be hurting if Ayuk goes off. So that finally clicked for me. But I mean, it's taken me a couple of years to really get the concept of leverage, even as much as you guys talk about it, for it to click in my head. So I love that if-then statement, though. That was perfect.
We can use, we can go from theory to mathematics as well to describe this. So Jaden Reed was projecting for about 5 times the ownership of Brandon Ayuk. Similarly, Jordan Mason was projecting for about 5 times the ownership of Josh Jacobs. So what the field is telling us is that if we played out this slate 100 times, Brandon Ayuk would outscore, or I guess we'll go the other way with it. Jaden Reed would outscore Brandon Ayuk all but like 18 times. So about 18%, if we work it out like 5 to 1 into 6, basically, about 18, 19%. Same thing. Jordan Mason would just on a raw points basis outscore Josh Jacobs about 83% of the time. So if that's the case, and we look at their projections were telling us that Jaden Reed would outscore Brandon Ayuk about 54% of the time.
Right.
Jordan Mason would outscore Josh Jacobs about 56% of the time. So when those don't match, this is a very like mathematically based example of leverage. Are we sure that like what the field is telling us is accurate? And I don't think it was last slate. So I didn't think that Brandon Ayuk was only going to outscore Jaden Reed like 18% of the time. I didn't think that Jordan Mason as a yardage and touchdown back, if those touchdowns just weren't going to him, and who would that potentially who would hurt his chances to score touchdowns and gain yards? Brandon Ayuk. Who would hurt like Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed? Josh Jacobs. And what was interesting to me about that slate is like we hadn't seen a normal game environment from the Packers through 4 weeks. In week 1, it was a back and forth shootout. They were playing in the fourth quarter from behind against the Eagles. Weeks 2 and 3, we had Malik Willis. And then week 4, they were down 28-0 and halfway through the second quarter. So we know LaFleur to be this like very reactive coach. He's elite at making those in-game adjustments and reacting. But he's typically not coming out like, I'm going to pass the football 9 times on the first drive because I want to like, that's not who LaFleur is. So it was clear to me that like, if they were in control of this game environment against the Rams defense that was giving up the second most total yards per game, the most rushing yards per game, that they would have had the opportunity to, as a team, 30, 32 carries. And I thought like even at 60%, Josh Jacobs had a clear path to 22, 24 of those carries. So that's the idea of leverage is if this guy's failing at high ownership, how is he failing? Then who does that benefit the most? Using the numbers example, like is this player going to outscore this player at the rate that ownership is telling us? And a lot of the times the answer is no. So that slate was really, really interesting. It was my favorite slate of the season. There were very clear paths to me how to generate that leverage, and didn't work out. The winner of the Millie scored 236.92. So I was about 10 points off.
Wow. Oh my word, dude. And yeah, in the large field too, with 10 lineups, that is mighty impressive right there. Cool. Well, let's jump into week 6 here, and I'm going to just open up DraftKings. And I did notice the 555 is on this slate. Do you want to attack that or something more like the SPY?
Let's do another double SPY build. Small field, single entry. Kind of let it cater the discussion or tailor the discussion to that.
Okay, yeah, that's this one I'm in is the smaller double SPY.
Yeah,
277 entries. You want to go back to
perfect. No, that's good. That's good. Let's do the small field.
Get back into it. Double SPY. Oh, now I'm in the
So with this, while you're pulling it up,
go ahead.
This is a good discussion for game theory as well. Contest selection, field sizes. Theoretically speaking, the larger the field size is, the closer to optimal we have to be. Conversely, the smaller the field size is, the further away, the more leeway we have away from optimal. Why do I say that? Because optimal roster on a given week typically doesn't have a ton of game environment bets, doesn't have a ton of correlation, doesn't have typically what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of like random one-off plays are going to be in the optimal roster, because if a sub 4K wide receiver goes for 25 points, he's going to be optimal. He's going to find himself into the optimal discussion, in the optimal lineup. Those are very, very difficult to capture at a high frequency as they're paired with the rest of the optimal roster. So if we look at like over the last 2 seasons in the Millie Maker, typically the winning roster was about 21 points lower than the optimal roster over a 3-year sample. So what does that tell me? Like even in the most entry contest, we don't need optimal. As we start getting the field sizes start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, we typically have more leeway away from optimal. So that's going to dictate and influence the decisions that we're making here.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool, man. Well, with that, here we are, week 6, obviously, again, a very early look, but you got 4 clearing away games that are kind of the top of the over-unders. Where you want to start with this lineup in terms of attacking?
So we got the Cowboys at home. Historically speaking, that's a spot we want to have interest in. And we have Brandon Cooks out, and we have a run game that still can't get going. They're also playing a pass funnel defense in the Lions. Nobody can run on them to begin with. So we're going to start this roster with a Dallas Cowboys overstack. We're going to do that overstack. We have that leeway because it's a smaller field. And we have the leeway to be further away from optimal. So we'll start with Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb. We'll go all the way with Tolbert and Ferguson here.
Like it. And by the way, just in case you guys are keeping track, 2 weeks ago you had the Dalton Carolina Panthers stack that smashed, and then last week Flacco. I mean, that was huge. Yeah. I mean, if somehow, Pittman and Downs had been like the guys instead of Alex Pierce catching those long touchdowns, that would have been close to the nuts as well. But there you go. There's your Dallas overstack. Yeah, that's basically getting all the pieces of the Dallas attack minus just a random vulture touchdown.
Yeah, so the way that this roster succeeds, I mean, we haven't even filled it out, but the way that this roster, the core of this roster succeeds is the Cowboys score 4 or 5 touchdowns. Whereas if on the other side of this game, even if the Lions score 4 or 5 touchdowns, it's very hard to say where those are coming from. They have JMO, they have Jahmyr Gibbs, they have Dave Montgomery, they have Amon-Ra St. Brown, they have Sam Laporta. That's a lot of names that are key primary pieces of that offense. So if Dak Prescott is throwing 4 or 5 touchdowns, it's highly likely that those are captured with this core of pass catchers. So a very, very different situation. And in this setup, because Detroit is who Detroit is, you don't even necessarily need a bring back.
Okay.
Very similar discussion to, it kind of played out this way in the Bengals and the Ravens. Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase combined for the massive yardage and touchdowns in that offense. And then Baltimore just didn't have concentration really because they were thrown into oh shit mode. So they drove the game environment and then you needed a missed field goal and overtime. And Henry returned a usable fantasy score just because of the state of the position last week, ripping off a 51-yarder in overtime. That was hilarious. Yeah. All he needed to hit something was a missed field goal and then winning the coin toss and then turnover in overtime. The way that happened was kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, this is a very similar situation. So you can pencil in David Montgomery. Let's put in David Montgomery just in this, just as a placeholder. The matchup is good on the ground. He's scored a touchdown in every game this season. It's very, very difficult for David Montgomery to give you a smash GPP score that you would have been kicking yourself if you didn't have, because the offense is not concentrated. There's Jahmyr Gibbs there. Jahmyr Gibbs took 2 goal line touchdowns last weekend. So while I don't love it, it makes sense. The matchup is good. We'll just leave him in as a penciled in, and then we'll come back to that spot.
Cool. Okay.
We'll go to defense next. Again, same mindset. We landed on the Broncos last week because it was scroll down and then start scrolling up until something is palatable. We'll do the same thing. We'll pencil in the Buccaneers. Derek Carr got injured last night on Monday Night Football, oblique injury. So same kind of type of injury as Anthony Richardson. We saw Richardson miss. If it's Jacob Hayner, if we don't know who's going to start for the Saints, if it's not Carr, but The Buccaneers are probably going to be licking their chops if it's Haener under center, a guy that does not have the same processing skills. The New Orleans offensive line got even more beat up. They had a rookie starting at center. Cesar Ruiz is out. So there's a lot kind of working against the Saints, we'll say. Yeah. And now you have a super, super aggressive defense on the other side that's going to be blitzing a lot. So we'll leave the Buccaneers in there. They're cheap. On the road, we don't like that, but everything else kind of aligns in the spot.
100%.
From here, I think let's take a look. We don't have a lot of salary left. So let's take a look at running back next and see as low as we can go and be comfortable.
So it's kind of like
probably like the 6K range, honestly.
Okay, so is that kind of where you typically start? Kind of like
no,
you know,
right
around
pricing.
6?
No, it's simply a function of pricing being so tight this season. So like knowing that we spent so much on our primary stack, like Jake Ferguson is a pay up tight end at this point. We have the highest priced player on the slate in CeeDee Lamb. Dak Prescott is not cheap. So knowing that, like, it's kind of this idea that we know we're going to have to save some salary here. And I think the first name that really jumps off the page to me is Tony Pollard.
Okay.
That's 6K. Tony Pollard playing the Chiefs, we know to be a soft matchup. Bottom 3 in most run blocking or metrics against the run. Tony Pollard is coming off a 22 carry game in a game environment that the Titans were able to control. The reason, or a reason that I would like Tony Pollard even more is if Anthony Richardson comes back. This Titans defense is difficult. They're difficult to run on. Even if Jonathan Taylor comes back, like, this defense should at home kind of put the clamps if it's Anthony Richardson, a guy who is like near the bottom of the league in efficiency metrics. He's either generating massive splash plays or negative plays. So that would make Tony Pollard even better in my eyes. Give him a more clear path to 22 plus running back opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah. Richardson, like, a turnover, something like that, setting up Tennessee with a short field. There's always that potential. Yeah.
So I like Pollard. Tajay Spears took like that incredibly athletic direct snap in for a touchdown. That was a read option play. He had Tony Pollard on an end around that he could have given the ball to. Pollard was in the slot right, and Tajay Spears took direct snap. Tajay Spears faked the handoff to Tony Pollard and then took it in for an end zone on a really, really aggressive hard cut. It was beautiful. But Tony Pollard could have just as easily scored that and had this massive fantasy game as well.
Absolutely. Love it. So yeah, 2 spots left and 4,800 remaining per player here.
Okay. So we're in full on salary saver mode. Let's go to wide receiver. We're not going to be able to afford another running back on this roster. So let's go keep scrolling down. Right in here, probably Trey Tucker. Let's put him in this roster. Terrible matchup, but we expect Joey Porter to see more of Jacoby Myers. So that leaves Trey Tucker. They're trying to keep him involved in the offense. They're giving him carries. He scored 2 weeks ago on a carry in the red zone. He's fast. He's a type of player that has the ability to put up like an Alec Pearson type score, like 3 for 101 type stuff. So we don't love the situation. We don't love the offense, but Trey Tucker, we don't love the matchup. But if there's somebody that's going to succeed, it's likelier to be Trey Tucker. So yeah, you see that.
Yeah, he's going to get looks.
Especially we don't expect Devontae Adams to potentially even be in town come the weekend. So we'll put in Trey Tucker. Let's see what that leaves us at flex. We're not going to go Trey Goodson, Bucky Irving. No, Jacoby Myers. We have Trey Tucker. Alec Pierce is way too priced up. We're not going to go Madison. Mooney is interesting, but honestly, instead of Mooney, now that I'm looking at the pricing, let's put Dontavian Wicks in the lag flop. Everyone's talking about how atrocious he was at ownership. I expect that to significantly influence his ownership. His price did not move because he had a poor game. And now we get this Arizona defense, who is the same thing we talked about with Ayuk, allowing the second most, or I haven't looked at the numbers now, but this was going into last weekend. Second most yards after contact, second most explosive plays, second most yards per pass attempt. So why does that benefit Wicks? Wicks is going to be the downfield guy in the Christian Watson role. So if those deep, and he had deep shots, they didn't connect. If those deep shots are connecting here, that's where we're getting the big bang for our buck. So now we have 200, and I was very curious to see how the pricing worked out here, because going from Darnell Mooney down to Dontavian Wicks gave us an extra bit of money to go from David Montgomery up to, so remove Montgomery, and that'll get us up to Bijan.
Okay. Bijan, oh, right. Okay. Yep. There we go.
So Bijan is interesting to me, and this was a reason why I liked Swift so much. DeAndre Swift, and I brought this up last week before the slate. DeAndre Swift had been all the way since his rookie season in 2020, since DeAndre Swift has put up 100 yards and multiple touchdowns. It's been a long time. But in that matchup against this Carolina Panthers defense, who had allowed a touchdown on 91% of opposing red zone trips, that gamble was a fine one to take. And DeAndre Swift last week had a touchdown, a goal line touchdown from 1 yard out. We know Roschon Johnson to be the goal line back. Roschon Johnson scored 2 touchdowns from the one. Yeah. Swift got one from the one as well, but Swift could have had another one. He scored, and it was called back for holding. So this team had a ton of opportunities against this Panthers defense inside the 5. So Swift almost had it. So Bijan is a very similar study to the Packers that we talked about with Josh Jacobs going into last weekend, in that the Falcons haven't really had, like, go back to their pull up Bijan's game log.
Oh, yeah.
The Falcons haven't really had like a normal game environment. They were behind all game against a tough defense in Pitt. They play the pass funnel Philadelphia Eagles next, and they win it in the you'll like that walk-off from Kirk Cousins. They play a negative game environment against Kansas City that's a defensive struggle. Then they play the New Orleans Saints, and the Saints were able to generate a ton of pressure, and they win it in walk-off fashion in overtime. That wasn't the overtime game. They win it in, I think it was a last-second kick. And then they take Tampa to overtime, and they're fighting to come from behind the entire game. So, like, very similar discussion to Josh Jacobs and Matt LaFleur. Like, how do we think Zach Robinson wants to run this team? Well, I don't know, but it's probably not exactly what we've seen. That was a murderer's row of like opening season opponents. You look at all those guys, all those guys are pass funnel, difficult matchups on the ground. So is this a spot Bijan hasn't seen the volume yet? Like, could this be the first week where we're getting a Bijan Robinson volume game against a defense that can't figure anything out? They don't have the defensive personnel. Like, I think it could be. And Bijan is priced at like he should be 1,000 more at minimum. So like that murderer's row of opponents like has brought his price down. He's not going to get ownership, or I don't expect him to. Maybe he does against Panthers. I don't know. But that's kind of this like, we have Darnell Mooney coming off of a 100-yard 2-touchdown game against the Panthers. The field is probably going there. But how does this idea of leverage, like how would Darnell Mooney fail, or how would Drake London fail? What if like we see this team operating differently in a game environment that they should control? Like they haven't seen that through 5 weeks. What if Bijan Robinson rips off a 60-yarder running zone coverage against like they run an outside zone run scheme that could be highly effective against the cover 3 high tendencies of Carolina. So like that spot, going from Mooney to Wicks now gives us this idea of leverage that we talked about earlier.
No, I love it. And I was just going to say, if you're still watching the video right now in like the 33rd minute or something like that, just keep it on Bijan. Don't say anything. Let him be low owned, because I love this play. And yeah, when you pointed him out at 6,600, I was like, wait a minute, what? He can't be that low. So this is I'm liking that call a lot. Hilow, man, great stuff. Anything else you wanna say before we close this one out?
Go to 1 week season, man. Get signed up for Inner Circle, because you'll get all this leverage, game theory, robust DFS breakdowns. So yeah, head on over there. Get signed up. Yeah, just to echo the thought, if you've been on the fence and thinking, oh, it's already week 6, probably too late. It's really not. Now is actually a great time. I feel like 1 week season, the edge just gets better and better. And last week, I would say, was one of the sharpest weeks that we've had over there so far this season. They've all been good, but the edge definitely, I would say, increases the deeper we get into the season. For sure. All right, Hilow, man, thanks again so much, and we'll see you throughout the week. Make sure to check out Hilow's show, Searching for Ceiling. That's at noon Eastern, right? That you guys do that on Friday? Or sometime around there. Yes, noon Eastern. Check it out. It's I had to think about it. I know. Sorry, I know you're Pacific time. Right now, I'm in Mountain, Arizona. That's so right, because right now we're Pacific. Yeah. No, everyone else shifts. We don't move in daylight savings, so that's right. Me up. Yeah, that's right. Okay, but anyway, check out his show with Rich Rebar. That's a really good show, and definitely worth a watch. Hilow, thanks again, man, for joining us.